Have you ever felt freezing cold and wet from the rain? And do you remember how good it felt to dry off and wrap up in warm clothes? Feels like something so normal, doesn't it? Well, not for Palestinians in Gaza, where winter means tens of thousands of makeshift tents are battered by heavy rains and floods. Nothing gets you dry, you can't get warm, the cold kills. Well, today we're talking about winter in Gaza. I'm Stephanie Decker, and welcome to The Stream, where we take digital trends and your online conversations and give them context. The war in Gaza hasn't stopped, and neither has the suffering. Well, that's a sentiment we've seen again and again across social media as people try to keep Gaza from slipping off the radar as it's making less international headlines. Well, I'm joined today by two guests who've both returned recently from Gaza. We've got Dr. Nada Abu-Aroub, a general practitioner and humanitarian doctor who is volunteering in Gaza. She left in October. And we have UNICEF spokesperson Tess Ingram, who was also on the ground in Gaza up until mid-December. Tess, let me start with you. You left in December. There is a so-called ceasefire happening right now. Many people abroad probably think life is much better at the moment. How would you describe the situation right now?
Well, when I left and continuing right up until today, it's wet, it's cold, and I was talking to colleagues this morning who tell me that the wind is still ferocious. And we're now 3 months into a so-called ceasefire. And what does a day look like, Stephanie, in the life of a child in a ceasefire? Well, everyone, I think, would agree that they should be able to sleep safely, wake up, get a warm drink and something to eat, have a shower, and then go to school. But at the moment in Gaza, children are really only getting 2 at the most of those 5 things. And the suffering really does continue. Even though the world is looking away, we are still seeing, of course, violations of this ceasefire, with more than 100 children killed since the ceasefire began, but also children dying from preventable causes like hypothermia, with 7 children dying already this winter from the cold.
That segues actually perfectly into what I wanted to ask Dr. Nada. What happens in the cold? What are the challenges that come in winter? And we've seen all the pictures of, tents flying and those winds you were describing there, Tess. The tents flood, you can't get dry, it's freezing cold. What does this do to someone? And who's more vulnerable?
If you allow me to first explain why winter is now used as a weapon, you need to understand the bigger picture of what's happening. So Gaza is at the moment under an illegal devil occupation system that kills every source of life and hope on a besieged population. So the bombing is still constant despite the ceasefire. The destruction has happened for almost 95% of the homes, the infrastructure, the sewage system, and there is no aid allowed in. So the aid that is allowed in is only less than 10% through the Rafah crossing, nothing from Jordan. When I went there, the medications were about to expire. They're there, they're waiting. It's not like there's not enough help. There is enough help, but it is blocked. More than 60 NGOs and humanitarian organizations have been forced to close because they don't want them to be a witness and because they refuse to be basically spies for the occupation, to give them the details of families and the movements of the Palestinians. So the medication is not allowed, caravans are not allowed in, the building tools and equipments, because it has been estimated that they need around $70 billion to repair all the destruction that is happening. So all of these kind of things you face, you feel it's another way of suffocating and killing. Us doctors, the last group that I spoke to that went in, after they gave them the approval, they returned them from the border because they had a stethoscope. So they basically, in written and in what they told them, you're not allowed to take any life-saving equipment. So how are we supposed to treat anyone? By your eyes, to do surgery with your eyes, or to treat sepsis with your words? So basically all of this has led to winter being one of the weapons used to kill those people. So they live in plastic tents, which are not good in summer and not good in winter. Those tents, they are flooding. They're flooding with water in. And when you have the blankets and they're wet, they're not going to protect you from cold.
Those are all very important points. And I want to bring in Tess. because Tess works for UNICEF, you're the spokesperson. Let's break this down, in terms of aid. What is coming in these days? And I want to ask you about those tents. So there was a recent report in the Guardian newspaper where they had researched, and they had one of the findings was that a lot of these tents coming in, particularly sent in by certain countries, simply weren't adequate enough to deal with the winds, to deal with the water. They weren't stitched heavily enough. What have you seen on the ground? What is lacking? What is getting in? What isn't?
As Dr. Nada described, there are families living under makeshift shelters because they don't have access to the shelter that they so desperately need. Tents have come in, but not in sufficient quantities for the hundreds of thousands of people who have had their homes destroyed, and more permanent transitional housing like caravans or prefabs are not being allowed into the Gaza Strip at the moment. And so what we see as a result is parents being forced to make an impossible choice. Do they live with their children in a tent where their children are at risk of hypothermia? 7 children, as I said, have died, or from dying from the flooding. I've been in these sites up to my knees in water, and just a few weeks ago, a 7-year-old boy drowned in the flooding in a displacement site. Or the alternative is, do they choose to live in a bombed out building that hasn't yet been able to be repaired because the heavy machinery and the construction materials are restricted?
Tess, sorry to jump in. Why isn't the aid going in? Dr. Nada was describing there what she saw in Jordan. Why is this being prevented by Israel to enter the Gaza Strip?
So we have seen an improvement in the volumes of aid that have come in. For example, at UNICEF, we've seen 400% increase in how much aid we've been able to collect on the Gaza side of the crossings since the ceasefire. But it's not enough because of the scale of the needs. We need to get far more in, and to do that, we need more crossings to open, and we need better procedures at the crossings so that the aid moves through faster. We also need to see some items that are being restricted to now be allowed in. So it's not just about volumes of aid, but it's about types of aid. And that's the point here around tents just not being sufficient for the dignity and quality of life for the 3rd winter now in Gaza.
Well, we are going to head to Gaza now. We have 17-year-old Ali, a Palestinian who taught himself English in order to tell the world what is happening in his homeland. Now, he takes us inside a displacement camp, showing us what winter looks and feels like when you have no real shelter.
The winter has returned to Gaza, and with it the suffering. People here have lost everything that once protected them. No walls, no homes to return to, and to shield them from the cold. All that remains are tents, pieces of prep bricks that couldn't withstand the wind, the rain, or the harshness of life.
اليوم يا جماعة انتم في المنخفض شايفين ايش اللي قاعد بصير معانا. كل الخيمة وقعت علي انا والاطفال تعوني. يا عم حلونا مشان الله يا ناس. اطفال قاعدة كلها غرقت كل خيمتي. خذ تفضل. هذا كل الريح وقع كل الخيمة. كل الخيمة وقعت وفيش حد مطلعنا.
Thousands of displaced families now live in these tents. The winter has become a daily nightmare. The fear that tents may flood, tear apart, or be blown away.
احنا مرميين في الشوارع زي الكلاب الله يعزكم. وانتم شايفين الوضع وشايفين الدنيا والناس مريضة والاجواء شتاء.
Winter has become a daily test of survival. Children, women, elderly, men all endure the same suffering. But some children couldn't endure it. Children are losing their life due to the extreme cold, the lack of food, medicine, and the absence of warm clothing. The reality in Gaza is too painful to be captured in words and too heavy to be told in a single video.
Dr. Nada, what happens to the body when you're extremely cold and you can't get warm? He's talking about children. The elderly and children, from what I understand, are more vulnerable to hypothermia and the effects of the cold. How would you describe it?
Correct. So with when the temperature goes down, the body, especially when there's no other source of heat, starts shivering and using all the energy and, burning the sugar and fat and whatever they have to use all these muscles to try to warm you up. But eventually, of course, the body gets tired, and the heart is also a muscle that gets tired, and the blood pressure drops, and then, the heart stops working as well. So it's kind of like a quiet sort of of death that happens. And with the kids, they have smaller bodies, so they lose heat quicker. And with the elderly, they have weaker bodies and other comorbidities, so they also die quicker. And particularly in Gaza, because the tents are flooded, so you can't get the heat in. And if you use the fire, those plastic tents they burn. So people are kind of between picking to die from freezing or die from burning. So we've seen kind of kids that were burnt, and we've seen kids that they turn into a piece of ice and they died. As Tess said, now 7 kids have died from hypothermia alone. And that's not the only disease that has spread in winter. Now, because the tents are flooded with the sewage water and it's very dirty, so there's a lot of diseases are spreading, like, for example, leptospirosis that comes from the urine of rodents. And then it can present with severe fever and flu-like symptoms. So it get misdiagnosed, especially that the labs now, the pathology labs don't have, they cannot run tests anymore. So it can easily be missed, and it causes chronic fatigue and in some severe cases death. And it's also contagious. On top of hepatitis A, when I was there was many cases of hepatitis A from dirty water, and kids were dying with cardiac arrest one after another because they're already malnourished, because they had a famine for a few months. And after the famine, the quality of food that goes in is really bad food. It's only canned food and chocolate. It's not really nutritious food at all, and it's very expensive, and money is not allowed in. So as I said, it's like suffocating from every direction. So when they have those infections, the medication is not available, and there's no enough beds, and basically they die because of the severe electrolytes imbalance. Like potassium goes really low, and that causes arrhythmias in the heart. And then kids and elderly, especially because they're weaker and smaller, they die from the heart stopping, a cardiac arrest. And I've seen many cases of that.
I'm sorry. Let me just jump in there. I want to get back to a little later about the state of the hospitals right now. But Tess, you work with children. I want to ask you about the parents. I think the instinct, isn't it, of a parent is to protect your child, particularly from something that we on the outside think is something so easy. You bundled up your child in a warmer jacket, you put on a scarf, you put on a hat, you take them out of the rain. Parents can't do that in Gaza. What have you witnessed?
It's something that I heard constantly, actually, Stephanie, that despair of a parent knowing exactly what their child needs, but not being able to meet the needs of the child, and seeing them get sick with disease, as Nada described, or malnutrition or hypothermia. And all of these things should be preventable, particularly now, 3 months into this ceasefire, when aid should be flowing at scale to allow us to address more of these needs. But yet we're still seeing this, and it's every parent's worst nightmare. As one father said, he said, I cannot access firewood, a heater, electricity doesn't exist in Gaza, and I have no walls. How am I meant to keep my baby warm? And I met another mother, Nesreen. I was actually walking through a flooded displacement site when I found her 7 months pregnant, staring at the collapsed remains of her shelter. And she had 5 children and a 6th on the way. Her husband had been killed just a few months earlier in an airstrike, and no options for that evening. How to get the kids dry, how to have somewhere for them to sleep that night. And UNICEF is able to help, thankfully, in some cases. We've provided thousands of tents and hundreds of thousands of set of winter clothes for children, thermal blankets, almost 1 million of those. But it's not enough, and we really need to keep bringing in more because the needs are so great.
And that's always the message, isn't it? It's not enough, and yet enough doesn't seem to get in. Well, we have this next video from Gaza, from Zainab Alwan. She's a woman who used to be an English teacher, and she's now coordinating fundraising efforts to get essentials and warm clothing to children. Since enough aid isn't making it into Gaza, as we've been saying, she's working through a small family-based foundation to try to fill the gap as much as possible.
كيف الجو بيكون؟ بارد. كيف هذا بدفي؟ حلو عليكي. As you know, our children lack most of things. They lack warm clothing, shelters, blankets, mattresses, and proper shoes. For us in winter, we know that our children could not buy. These things affect greatly on their physical and psychological well-being. Warm clothing may seem as a small thing. We can provide it for our children, but that it can make a difference in our children's life. As you know, our children live in tents, live in damaged homes. We provide for them these warm clothing in order to give them a sense of safety, in order to allow them to move, to play, and to learn without being afraid, without having a pain caused by cold and rain. For me as a teacher living in Gaza, living the displacement period and losing my job, my income, gives me a deep understand of the suffer of people around me, my people. Our children need a lot of things, need to be protected.
Such simple things that we take for granted on the outside, isn't it, that are lacking and denied inside Gaza. Dr. Nada, you've done incredible work. We've talked to you before on the show. You sent us clips from absolutely horrendous conditions in the hospital that you were working under. I understand you were mentioned by name by Israel to have to leave the Gaza Strip. You wanted to extend your stay to help in the hospitals. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your reaction to it?
Yeah, sure. Well, because first I've been told before we go that we're not allowed to post anything until 6 months after we leave Gaza and after the approval of, organizations and being reviewed and things. It's kind of as a way to silence you, not to do what's happening. And of course, I at the start I followed the rules because my main thing was going there to treat patients and going there as a doctor. So I didn't have in mind to post anything or say anything. But what I found when I went there, I was especially in the north, people were dying, like the mass casualties were coming in tens and hundreds, and they were even cutting the electricity. And whomever we can even treat, some of them, they die later on with the infection and the complete family are wiped out. So you think about it, like what's the amount of help that I'm providing? I'm saving few lives and, God knows what will happen to them later. But the scale of thing is really bad and people need to hear about it. And they're killing the journalists, the Palestinian journalists, and they're not allowing any foreign journalists to go in. So I felt I'm obliged to speak up. So when I spoke first, and I didn't actually kind of follow up and see what's happening because the internet is so weak and I was cut out. Then I start getting threats calls from the occupation, from the IOF in Arabic, and saying basically, are you going to stay silent, or are we know how to get rid of you silently? And those kind of threats, the drone above my head, coming in front of the window where we sleep, and those kind of things. But there you get some kind of courage. Like people are kind of, putting all their kids and all their life they're going. I'm not going to be a hypocrite just because I'm worried about my own life, right? So yeah, it was kind of all these threats all the time. But then I got severely sick and I got GI bleeding and things. I'm not sure if it was by accident or or not. I can't prove that. And so I really got unwell. So they put my exit date without telling me, and then they sent me the exit date before my actual date via message, like you're to leave on the 5th of October, and it's been approved for you to leave Gaza. So the organization told me that they said we want Nada out, basically.
In your experience as a doctor in conflict zones, how would you quantify what you have seen in Gaza? Is it the worst you've seen? Have you seen worse? My brain cannot until now believe what I saw. Like it was like a slaughterhouse. It was like a horror movie. Like literally, kids were arriving with their neck open, with their brain matter all out. They're basically being targeted while they're playing. As I said, the beheaded, the pregnant lady, and people coming into pieces. Many arrived in plastic bags with their leg and arms in plastic bags, and the whole family is kind of arriving together, from grandmother to the uncles, aunties, cousins, kids, mother and father. They're all kind of been bombed together. So it's basically like no one can believe that anything could be that
cruel and that illegal, and kept on going. Like, no matter how they're screaming, they're asking for help. There is no country, Western or Arabic or Islam, whatever. No one is doing anything. So it just shows the world, like what point did we reach, which is very, very sad. And, you don't like to believe that this is the world that we're living in.
Tess, if I can ask you to step away from your position as a spokesperson of UNICEF and speak to you on a more personal level. You just came out of Gaza. How did you feel about what you've witnessed? We heard from Dr. Nada there undescribable scenes and images of what she's had to, deal with, try to help with. What about you? How would you describe the situation 2 years on?
I first went to the Gaza Strip in January 2024. So I've been there many times from almost the very beginning of the horrors of what we've seen in Gaza. And I have similar stories to Dr. Nada and to others around how this conflict has impacted children and their families. And I think that's the important thing here. Dr. Nada describes injuries, but we have to remember that every single one of these people is a child, is a member of a family, and the impacts have lasting ripple effects and repercussions.
Mentally, people, right? There's a lot of psychological impact that this is going to have.
Of course, yeah. They're going to stay with Palestinian people in Gaza for generations, and people who somehow miraculously managed to survive an airstrike that killed their entire family, they continue now to try and survive these awful winter storms that we're talking about. And as you say, the mental health impacts of what they've experienced. So, even now with the constant violations that we're seeing in the ceasefire, as I said, more than 100 children killed, and the headlines dropping, this is a moment where the world needs to not look away and continue to stand with people in Gaza, because this is not over, and there is a lot more that needs to be done.
This is not over. Dr. Nada, what do you think is going to happen if nothing changes? There's a ceasefire, so on the surface, people think, oh, well, that's great news, right? But I mean, people haven't been able to go home. They haven't been able to rebuild. The infrastructure, the social fabric of Gaza has been completely annihilated. They're living in tents. They can't even survive, a storm, rain, high winds. How do you see things moving forward?
Right. First, they haven't been a ceasefire. Even that has been a lie, and I think to distract people from Gaza a little bit. So the fear is still constant because you can't trust them. They tell you this is a safe zone, and then they're still until, today and yesterday and the day before, they're bombing south, for example, Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah and other areas which are supposed to be safe areas, and they're expanding the yellow line and everything illegal. It's happening. So people cannot feel safe. They're still sitting outside their tents. I've lost many friends that I know now, nurses and doctors, who were sitting outside and they got bombed during the ceasefire. So first, there is no ceasefire, and the situation is unlivable. So talking about winter now, even the houses that are destructed are falling on people and they're dying. And you tell people not to go there; it's not safe. But they tell you we don't have other option. That reminds me when they were going to the GHF sites, which were death traps, and you tell them not to go, but they were desperate because they needed to bring food to their kids. And just talking about winter before I talk about kind of what I think will happen is now as well, respiratory diseases and COVID are spreading. And when I was there, unfortunately, we couldn't treat elderly that comes with respiratory infection because there was no oxygen and no ICU beds. And the priority are for younger people who have a higher chance of survival. And they used to cut the electricity on the ICU patients and they died that way. And the first patient that I met in Gaza, it was a little girl. Her father was carrying her. She was unconscious. And she died later on just from low potassium because of the dirty sewage flooding water. And then after a few hours, her brother came and he's like, please, can you save my son? Which thank God we managed to save him, but he wasn't able to walk. So to that extent, they're desperate. It's unlivable. And it's sad to see that now people are shifting. They're so attached to their land and they fought so much. But now most of the people in Gaza, they just want to, they actually want to unfortunately, but they just want to leave to live and let their kids live because no one is helping them and they're tired.
I think it's important to remember that it's, Israel controlling the border crossings. The Rafah crossing is also controlled by Egypt. So many calls for things to change, a lot of good work being done by both doctors and NGOs in the United Nations. Ladies, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for coming on and giving us your stories from what remains very much a very, very important and pressing story. And thank you for watching. From me and the entire Stream team, I'll see you soon.